Welcome back to the Deliberate Leaders Podcast. I am your host and executive coach, Allison Dunn. Today's topic is women trust more than men, but lose trust faster over time. And our guests are Ashley Reichheld and Amelia Dunlop. Ashley is the principal at Deloitte Digital and works with clients across industries to help them reimagine brands. Amelia Dunlop is the Chief Experience Officer at Deloitte Digital and a principal at Deloitte that helps organizations solve tough problems using human-centered design. They are both the co-author of the 4 Factors of Trust, which will be out on the shelves in November. Ashley and Amelia, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. I love to kick these off with a deliberate conversation. And since I have 2 guests, I'm going to start with Amelia first, if that's okay. What would be your number 1 leadership tip for our listeners today?
Oh, I love how you jump right in. I think for me, it would have to be something around the topic of humanity. As you mentioned, I wrote the book on elevating the human experience, which simply means being intentional about making experiences just a little bit better for people. But I think in the workplace, particularly now, gone are the days where we hide behind the professional kind of veneer. I'm as likely to have, one of my children kind of show up during this podcast as anybody else. And I think we're mindful now that showing up with vulnerability is one of those ways that we can actually build trust, both with our team members, our colleagues, and ultimately with our customers. And humanity actually means doing those small moments that really matter. So one of mine that I often talk about is I created something in the middle of the pandemic, Allison, called Joy Day, which is Wednesdays, and just sharing one thing that kind of brings you joy, and letting your team member kind of do the same, and it just sort of changes the atmosphere just a little bit on what used to be known as Hump Day. I like to think of it as Joy Day, and so that just leading with a little bit more humanity is one of the tips I'd share with your listeners.
I absolutely love that. So how do you tee up that in a conversation? What is your joy today, or today's Joy Day? Share something. Like, how does that look?
Or I would say something like, what brings you joy today?
What brings you joy today? Love it.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Great tip. Thank you, Amelia. Ashley, what is your number 1 tip for our listeners?
So Amelia and I are actually using 2 of the 4 factors, I think, in our leadership. Well, Amelia is using humanity. I'll share transparency. I think one of the things that a lot of leaders get wrong is we think we need to keep things from teams, kind of shelter them, or maybe we just don't have time to bring them up to speed. And what I've learned is that being transparent and sharing the kinds of information that you need to be successful is really important. I lived in Holland for the better part of a decade. And there's a word that the Dutch have called bespreekbaarheid, and it basically means anything that can be talked about should be talked about. I very much take that to heart. So making sure my teams have everything they need to know in order to get things done. And then I'd be careful to call it relevant transparency. There can be a point of too much information. So as a leader, you have to very carefully balance what you are sharing. But largely, the more people understand why it is they're doing what they're doing, the better they're going to do.
Fantastic. Transparency and humanity, both fantastic tips. Thank you very much. The episode topic today is women trust more than men, but lose trust faster over time. And one of the things that you talk about is the trust gap. Can you explain what that is or what that means?
Well, I think we have to start by talking about how we think about trust. And the way we think about trust is trust is a massive driver of behavior. And we know that. And companies kind of know, hey, we need to build trust with our customers and our employees. And I think leaders know that they need to be trusted by their teams in order to get things done. Yet it's not really something we all focus on. It's something that we kind of take for granted. And the companies that do ask about trust ask, hey, do you trust me? And often that's not really a great way to gather data. It's super hard to answer that question. Do you trust me to what? Do you trust me to show up on time? Do you trust me to put my kids to bed on time? I don't know. What do you trust me to what? So when we started our research, we actually wanted to break down what are the drivers of trust. So instead of asking people, do you trust? We can ask about, do you think a company has humanity? Are they transparent? Are they capable of delivering against their promises? Do they do that reliably? Those 4 factors are the drivers of trust, and that's how we measure it. So when we talk about the trust gap, what we're really talking about is how do different members, or how do employees, how do customers think about the organizations they interact with across those 4 factors? Amelia, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the pattern we see with men and women?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the first thing we see is that as leaders, we overestimate how much we're trusted both by our employees and by our customers by about 40 and 50% respectively. So that's the first gap, is this aha, that trust matters to drive behavior, but we're not as trusted as we think we are. So that's one thing that we would share. But then the other thing that was interesting to us, Allison, is that we noticed that women start out trusting as much, if not more than men in early parts of their career, but that steadily declines by almost 15 points up to and unless they reach the C-suite, or they're 55 and it's no longer relevant. And so this is one of the things that we thought we'd kind of explore a little bit with you, is this declining trust that we observe among women.
What do you think is the cause of the declining trust?
Well, I would say first and foremost, trust is declining overall. Institutions like Gallup and Pew have been measuring trust for the last 40 years, and it is really a straight line down. People don't trust as much in organized religion, in government, in healthcare. So really a lack of trust is epidemic in the US and to some degree globally. What we're seeing is that this impacts women more than men. And when you kind of take a step back and think about how we're treating people, it largely makes sense. It's really hard to trust a system that doesn't work for you. And we can talk about all kinds of examples, but if you think about as being a purchaser, trust in automotive for women is really low. But cars are kind of built for men. In fact, most vehicle manufacturers, when they're testing cars, use an average male dummy, a 5'10" test dummy, to test whether or not it's safe. What that really means is that cars aren't quite as safe for people who aren't an average 5'10" male. And actually the risk of dying as a female driver is quite a bit higher than as a male driver. So if you are a female driver, do you trust as much in that car? It's kind of hard to suggest that you should.
Absolutely. And I think it's a good tie back to an example of where that does get diminished over time.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing in the workplace, Allison, is that we know that women trust less than men, and that gap increases by 500% when you actually introduce kind of variable-based pay and performance-based compensation, which that also struck us. And we hypothesize that gap is largely kind of tied to the pay gap, right? We know that women are paid on average 83 cents on the dollar to a man, but also that sort of hidden expectation of extra hours, extra work, uncompensated labor, and perhaps that time away from the home, where women are less likely to trust than men.
That's a really good point, Amelia. And another stat to add to that that's also super interesting is women also trust about 60% less than men when they don't have flexible work hours. If you think about it, what they're really saying is, look, you're not trusting me to do the work on my time. You want me to do it on your time. That doesn't suggest a high degree of humanity.
What types of things do we need to do as a society, as a humanity, to build more trust internally within our teams? What are some of the techniques that you're suggesting?
Well, we think first and foremost, measure trust. We're encouraging everybody to take a look at the 4 factors, start with that baseline. And these 4 factors really do describe the components of trust, right? Trust at its core is when you make and keep good promises. Making good promises is described as humanity and transparency. Am I making you a promise that's relevant and beneficial for you? Am I telling you everything you need to know about it? And then can I deliver against that capability and reliability? So start with those and measure and understand where your trust gaps are. And then Amelia, maybe you want to talk about how we ideate on that.
Well, for sure. I mean, I think the other thing that we created the 4 factors, Allison, largely because we as leaders wanted something that we could use, right? We could use with our own practices and our own teams and with our own customers. And what's really beautiful about the 4 factors is they're as simple as they are actionable. But what I love most about them is they predict behavior, right? So as a social scientist, they predict behavior up to 74% of the time. And so to your question, like, what can we actually do? So yes, start measuring it. but more importantly, start predicting the behaviors that are most likely going to grow trust for your audiences, whether it's for the women that you want to focus on or other demographics in your organization.
Allie, I would love to put a finer point on what we mean by drives behavior. Is it okay if I do that?
Please do. Yes.
Well, so as an example, when a company is considered to have a high degree of humanity, customers are 280% more likely to stick with them when they make a mistake. An example that we're working on right now is in airlines. The summer was a really tough time for airlines. There were a lot of flight delays. For one of our airline clients, we looked at what happened when you had trust or didn't have trust when people were delayed. When a customer trusted this airline and they were delayed, there was a net zero impact to their perception. However, when they didn't trust the airline to begin with, and then they were delayed, we saw a negative 25% decrease. And you can picture this, right? You're flying on the airline and you trust them and you say, you know what, delays happen. That's the way it is. There's weather, there's all kinds of stuff. But if you don't trust them, you're sitting there saying, hey, did you give my crew to somebody else? Is it a mechanical failure? What are you doing that caused this delay? So it does drive resiliency. On the employee side, as an example, back to behaviors, when an employer is considered to be highly capable, you see a 50% drop in people looking for other jobs. So it really does drive targeted behaviors that companies are trying to build.
Is there some predictive behaviors that we're talking about that if someone's listening right now, they could go like, ooh, I'm in trouble. Maybe I don't have as much of a reflection of humanity that I feel like I'm displaying. So are there some key behaviors that we would see and be able to identify maybe mostly accurately?
Well, I would say that one of the things that we like about the 4 factors of trust is you don't have to wait for somebody else in your organization to go start doing something. You yourself, to your point, you as a leader, you can kind of start to think through, what am I doing to demonstrate each of these 4 factors? And I think one of the most beautiful ways to think about this is as your leadership philosophy. So Ashley, do you want to share your leadership philosophy?
Oh, I actually shared my leadership. I published it for my team so they can see it. And it's based on the 4 factors. I try to be human. And I learned a lot from Amelia in this degree. Take the time to get to know people, take the time to check in, just treat people like you want to be treated and make it about them, not about you. Be transparent. We talked about that a little bit. And of course, you have to show up capably and reliably. Those are baseline components for anybody. You got to be able to do the things that you're promising that you can do.
Okay. And that feels very foundational, but I feel like you can point to predictive behaviors based on all of those. So good. In your leadership tip, you were talking about transparency. I think it was in part of the introduction. Can you explain the balance between that and what that actually provides, being a proactive, transparent leader?
Amelia, I'm sure you're going to die to dig in this. Let me talk about it from an organizational perspective first, because I know this is really important to both of us. But this is actually one of the things that a lot of organizations get wrong. When we look at trust scores across industries, it's more likely that you're low on transparency versus reliability and capability. So it is the secret sauce or element that people are missing. And what we describe it as is kind of the equivalent of vulnerability for companies. You build trust in moments of vulnerability. When I make myself vulnerable to you, I'm trusting you to do right by me, so to speak. And so transparency is a great way for companies to demonstrate vulnerability. But to your point, there is a very careful balance you have to hit. You can't spend hours and hours and hours telling people everything. We've all gotten a legalese 500 pages of information when you want to open up a new account, right? There's probably not time to read all of those. So we want to help people understand what they need to know. One of the examples we love to use is, let's say you're at a farm-to-table restaurant. It is really cool to know where the food comes from, know about the farmer and his or her family and how the food's grown. All that's great. What you probably don't want to know is the name of the animal you might be eating or how that particular animal is processed. There's an amount you need to know and an amount you don't need to know.
That's a great example.
Yeah, and I think the thing I would add to that is that that it applies also to the individual leadership perspective. So just in the same way from an organization that Ashley talked about, from a personal leadership philosophy, transparency is also very connected to authenticity. And the fact that, I often tell this story where I was showing up to a coffee chat in the Zoom world with some new employees. And I remember at the end of it, one younger woman said something about like that I showed up as refreshingly authentic. And when I asked her what she meant by that, she said, that it was unusual to kind of, to feel that someone was being so transparent with them. And what I remember saying to her that it would take me longer to figure out which version of myself the entire team wanted me to be than to actually just be who I was. And so that kind of transparency, we can show up as individual leaders as well as kind of how we show up for our customers and organizations.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amelia. One of the areas that I'm hoping to kind of shed some more light on. So we're talking about humanity and being humans first, and we're all humans first. And I think that's what makes the whole world a beautiful place, because we're all unique. How can we plan for human error so that making mistakes doesn't derail the trust that we're looking to establish?
Well, I mean, I think what I love about that is it's acknowledging that to being human does not mean being perfect. Right. And I think we sometimes forget that. We sometimes forget that embracing our own humanity in others is acknowledging that we're not going to do everything perfectly. But I think, like Ashley shared earlier, that one of the things we realize is that if we make a mistake, but we already have high humanity scores, we're 280% more likely to stick with that brand after a mistake. And so that's why investing in humanity before you need it makes sense from a brand perspective.
Good example. Ashley, did you have anything to add to that?
It was perfectly said.
Okay, well, I'm just going to shine a little bit of a light. I feel like in the transition that maybe airlines is a great example. So I've just recently flown. I've always been a significant Southwest fan, and I'm not calling them out on it, but there was clearly a distrust from one of their agents to all of the flyers, kind of explaining the behavior she was expecting, and must be kind to each other. And I'm thinking, well, that messaging is okay, but as a person standing in line, I'm like, what is she trying to say? And handled one of the passengers in a way that actually created a bunch of distrust with everyone else behind her. And I just found that very interesting, that while she was trying to communicate maybe a level of behavior, the distrust by stating it the way that it was stated created other distrust, which was very unfortunate and shadowed the way that I actually look at the brand, unfortunately.
It's not the first time we hear that. One of the things that I think people forget is that you have to give trust to get trust. If
Absolutely.
you start from a position of, I don't trust you, that is likely the reaction that you're going to get back. People tend to live up to or down to your expectations. So if you're setting the expectation low, you're likely going to be driving people down there. It's one of the things we talk a lot about with companies. There's a big debate right now, for example, on workforce productivity. We're still in a hybrid environment. Lots of people working from home. The transition back to the office has been rocky in places. And to manage that, a lot of companies want to start tracking things like productivity. How many mouse clicks are people actually doing what they say they're doing? That's the last thing we would encourage companies to track. In fact, what we would say is that's an outcome. And what you really want to measure is the drivers. What is driving the behavior that you're looking at, which is another reason we encourage people to look at trust, for example. When companies are trusted by their workers, those workers are 80% of those workers are motivated to work versus just 30% who don't trust those companies. So it makes a really big difference.
Okay. Thank you for highlighting that. One of the statistics I have is why women trust brands 12% less than men across industries. What drives that? And does that go back to that the vehicles are made with men?
Right. It's that, and also one of the other things, the phenomenons that we hear a lot about, which is the shrink it and pink it, right? Where as women, we will be charged as much or more for a product, whether it's dry cleaning services or shampoo, which is essentially the same product, but because it specifically has a pink label on it, we'll be charged more for it.
Okay. I would imagine that actually that factor is probably a little bit higher. Is the 12% based on tons of research, or just a general, where does the factor come from? I would imagine it actually would be higher than 12%.
So it's interesting because we see trust levels change depending on what else is happening in the environment.
Okay.
When Amelia and I started this research, we've actually done several rounds of research with employees. And the first round of research we did was right in the heat of the pandemic. There was a lot of racial tension. You can kind of picture this, everything feeling like a boiling pot. And at that point in time, we saw more significant discrepancies in trust levels by ethnicity, by gender, by sexuality. The more other you were, the less you trusted. Now, fast forward 6 months, 12 months down the road, and those trust scores kind of came back up to parity. It was more of a normal environment. There wasn't as much disenfranchisement, and so trust surfaced again and was level. The reason that's so interesting is because it means that as leaders, you have to pay attention to what we call trust flags, those things that are simmering right below the surface. And while things might appear to be okay at the moment, that 12% gap, for example, it has the possibility of breaking wide open. So you have to be measuring for these different things anyway.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Amelia, one of the things that we love to talk about in this particular category, actually beyond trust flags, is the notion of lived experience versus demographics, because we were really surprised by that outcome.
Explain that. I just want to make sure that
Sure.
I hear what you're saying.
So we had a hypothesis that the demographics, right? Your race, your sexual orientation, these are the things that would most likely predict your trust behaviors. And it turns out that just wasn't the case, but that it was your what we call your lived experience, which is a combination of your agency and expectation, and it's the kind of cumulative different variables that make up your life. And so these are the things that we realized both in the workplace. So your lived experience is the more senior you are, whether or not you're a parent, that these are the things that made you more likely to trust. And then similarly, your lived experiences, not just your race over time, are more predictive of behavior.
But there's an important intersection to touch on here too, which is that they're not entirely separate, right? Your identity does influence how you're treated and can shift your lived experience. I'll give you a personal example from my own life as a way to translate that. My partner is Dutch. And so for many years, our marriage license wasn't recognized outside by the country. So we had to live outside. When we finally came back after DOMA fell down, after DOMA fell down. Let me say that again. When we finally came back after the Supreme Court got rid of the Defense of Marriage Act, we decided to have kids. We now have twins who are turning 5 this November. My parents live in Ohio and wanted to go visit them, but my daughter has type 1 diabetes. So we were aware that it's possible in an emergency she might end up in the hospital. While both my partner and I are on their birth certificates, Ohio wouldn't actually consider my partner to be a biological parent. So if for some reason Murphy was in the hospital, she wouldn't be able to visit her. She didn't have any visitation rights. So in order to safely visit my parents in Ohio, we had to adopt our own children, which is kind of crazy to think about, right? So that component of our lives, the fact that we were married to each other, led us to be treated a bit differently. And that has shaped how I think about trips to Ohio. Your lived experience and your identity have an intersection.
That's a great example. And that is seems very archaic. I'm not even sure what the right word for it is, but
I think that's well said.
Okay, good. Why is trust hard to build and so easy to lose?
I mean, there's so many reasons, right? I think one of the is the fact that you can't build trust once and for all, right? Mm-hmm. That it matters in every single moment, along whether it's a customer journey or employee journey. So I think that's one of the reasons that it's hard. It's hard because it's built across every function in your organization, every leader. So it's not the single remit of a leader, although they each have a role to play. And I think it's easy to lose just because we have expectations. And if we're not able to fulfill those expectations, then I think we end up losing trust. And I think it just goes back to what Ashley said earlier. It's the making a good promise and keeping it. And if we're unable to keep that promise, we're going to lose trust.
The setting expectations is really important. And a lot of companies don't necessarily do this really well. When an experience doesn't live up to your expectations, you will lose trust. That is just the way it goes. And so companies have to do a good job of setting expectations and also coaching people along the way. Airlines is a really good example for that too. Imagine it's the first time you've flown, and all of a sudden you hit this massive turbulence, kind of holding onto your seat for dear life, hoping the plane doesn't go down. Meanwhile, the person next to you is working away on their computer, a frequent flyer who does this all the time. And they're just thinking, look, don't spill your coffee on me. It's all going to be fine. The expectation that you have set based on your own experience or set based on what the company does for you is really important.
I completely agree. And it is amazing that sometimes we can have even unrealistic expectations that causes loss of trust. And there's like no baseline for it. Like if you can't even position for it because it's just unrealistic going in, maybe not the standard, but it can happen.
Another really interesting dimension that might be worth exploring there is agency. When we talk about trust, we talk about both agency and expectations. Agency is your ability to control outcomes, right? And so the more agency you have, the more control you have and the more trust you have ultimately that the solution is going to work for you. So the other thing that companies or organizations should consider is how much agency they're getting people. Are you able to find what you need when you need it? Do you have to ask for help to do that? And if you do, is that help readily available? It also explains a little bit of what you're seeing between the male and female dimension at work, because there's a direct correlation with how much you trust and how senior you are. When you're at the highest levels of the firm, you have a lot of control, a lot of agency, and therefore your trust levels are much higher because you have a much greater degree to influence outcomes.
I like the concept of the concept of agency. That's actually super powerful. How do you give people agency? How can people determine how can you encourage less senior folks to have a sense of agency when they do? Because maybe senior leaders just assume that they do because they do. Do you understand what I don't know if
I totally get it.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. This is actually one of the topics Ashley and I were talking about just this morning, because as you probably can tell, we are both passionate not only about the topic of trust generally, but what this means for women in the workforce. And we were thinking about exactly your question. What can you do to give someone a sense of trust in themselves who might not already have it or might not feel like that's reflected in the organization that they're a part of?
Right.
And so what we were talking about is similarly to the idea of giving trust to get trust, that whenever I'm around a kind of young kind of female in our workplace, I always try to remind them what it is that they're good at, because we simply just don't tell people that enough. And I think one of the things that limits our own ability to kind of see ourselves kind of growing in an organization is that kind of mind game that we get into when you don't see yourself reflected in leadership, when you don't see yourself reflected in the organization around you, that you can start to distrust yourself. And so one of those simple things is just to kind of flip that and to remind ourselves that that we are worthy of trust and that we are worthy of the type of work that we love doing.
And you see this reinforced in our data too. Just a quick example is companies that have flexible working hours tend to have a higher degree of trust with women, largely because we're saying you can do the work on your own time. We trust that you get it done.
In the intro, one of I think it was Ashley had developed a platform to measure groundbreaking measurement tool poised to become a gold standard for evaluating organizational performance. What is that, and how does the organization get tapped into that? I'm just curious.
Well, it's a team of folks who helped to create this. What we call it the HX TrustID, and it is based on the 4 factors that we've been talking about: humanity, transparency, capability, and reliability. And it is designed as a simple measure organizations can use. A survey with employees, with customers, with partners. It's just 4 questions, and it can give you a pulse of what's really happening behind the surface of trust, what's driving trust or eroding trust for you. In our book coming up, The 4 Factors of Trust, we actually publish the questions that companies can ask, along with all the attributes that sit underneath it that drive each of the factors. And we encourage companies to use it. Amelia will also point out, I'm sure, that one of the things we recommend to companies is beyond just asking. We really try to move people to predicting it too. So we've actually created a platform that organizations can use to not just measure trust, but to look forward and predict trust based on behavior. So instead of having to ask people all the time, hey, do you trust me? Do you trust me? Do you trust me? You can tell whether or not they trust you and to what degree by looking at their behavior.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I love saying is that when I'm asked, Allison, about what can you do to kind of start to build trust, what I like to say is the first thing you can do is start measuring trust, right, and kind of start surveying and using these questions. But then the second thing you can do is stop surveying, right, because nobody wants to be surveyed as frequently as we currently are, and we know there's so much bias in the system. So let's begin by surveying to kind of set a baseline, but then let's start predicting behavior and stop surveying everyone.
Allie, I'm curious, did you get a survey from Southwest on your flight?
I am not sure. So I've flights recently. They did not send me a survey, but the Alaska flight that I flew home on Sunday, they did ask.
And
so
did you fill it in?
I did not.
It's a trick question. It's a trick question because
I would have given Southwest feedback. I wouldn't have Alaska because it was perfect.
The reason I ask you that question is because most people don't fill out the survey unless they had a problem or unless they had a really great experience. And so you're not really getting great data as a result of that. And I think the other problem is that most companies don't do a great job of acting on that feedback. So it even makes the problem worse. You tell them what a terrible experience you had. It goes somewhere into the vacuum of market research at the company and not into customer service so nobody can help you. And then you just feel worse because nobody's bothered to take the time to say, hey, I'm really sorry that happened to you.
Right. Yeah. I've got, I probably have an interesting, I have a small team, so it's not a large department that the feedback goes to, but my feeling is when we get feedback, we're co-creating together. Right. And so if I'm feeling undervalued in some way, I need to figure out what I need to do in order to, what do I need to do to feel more valued and then do those actions. Right. So the ownership side of feedback, I think, is really important. I did try to reflect if there was something that we were doing as a group at the Southwest, airline terminal to figure out if we were somehow eliciting this and realizing that there's nothing I could change on that one either. So, ladies, I so appreciate our conversation today. I just want to make sure I see that I have an Amazon link for the 4 Factors book. Is it out or coming out?
November 1st is the published date.
Excellent. Oh, good. Okay. This will be just in time. As people are listening to this, it will be out within a week of that.
Oh, that's so cool. I hope that works.
Yeah.
We purposely made the Trust ID open source so that anybody can access it, have it, use it. You can even download it from our website. So we very much hope that people start measuring the 4 factors as a starting point.
Okay, fantastic. Actually, Amelia, thank you so much. Amelia, did you have something to add there?
I just wanted to add one last thing, which is your listeners probably can tell we're super passionate about trust. But the other thing we didn't get a chance to talk about was that it kind of those organizations that are kind of outperform their peers on trust are 400% more likely to kind of outperform on overall performance. So it's not just grow trust because trust matters. It's grow trust because it will help kind of grow your organization overall.
Ultimately, and I think that is a fantastic wrap-up thought, that just trust in general grows everything in addition to your employees. That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I am going to include the link to the book that is coming out on November 1st in the show notes. And I just so appreciate our conversation this afternoon.
Allie, it was nice to meet you. Thank you for having us. And we'll look forward to listening to you. Neither of us will look forward to listening to ourselves, but we will check it out.
Wonderful.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.